There's a sense here that there's a reminder of one's mortality, of one's perishability, but also as we find ourselves breaking and consuming this biscuit, an encounter with, that very natural process of consuming and eating. And if we think back to the memento mori, in the memento mori tradition, the human body becomes itself a meal for the worms. It becomes something that will nourish these most lowly of creatures, these conquering worms, so small in stature, but ultimately so triumphant.
Welcome to A Curious Appetite with Dr. Pino. In this episode, I'm curious to find out about a day in the life of a death historian and what foods are associated with the afterlife. We begin in 18th century rural Yorkshire with a biscuit wrapper. But we don't remain there. What follows is not a single object, but a sequence, a movement through the ritual itself. We move from the wrapper to what it contains, from the biscuit to the hands that distribute it, from the public moment of the funeral to the private act of later consumption. And along the way, we encounter materials, gestures, and structures that shape how grief is organised and experienced. Each object opens outwards. The wrapper leads us to the biscuit leads us to the body leads us to absence. This order is not accidental. It follows the path that mourning itself takes, from the visible and structured to the intimate and internal, and finally to what can no longer be seen. Because food has long been part of how we live with death. Why are biscuits, though, so common in funerary contexts? What does it mean to eat at a moment of loss? And can something as small as a biscuit help us confront our own perishability? Today we're exploring what we might call memorial cuisine, food that does not simply nourish but remembers, food that sits between the living and the dead. We'll encounter arval bread and funeral biscuits, black sealing wax and printed hymns, woodcuts and wrappers, objects that are handled, read, shared and ultimately consumed. We'll think about the role of women in managing funerary ritual, particularly in rural communities where care, distribution and quiet authority often shaped the experience of mourning. We'll also move through voices and traditions, from travellers like Henry Misson to the hymns of Charles Wesley to the memento mori tradition, where the body itself is imagined as something that returns to the cycle of consumption, a meal ultimately for worms. Even the drink matters. Did you know that white mulled wine was commonly served at funerals in the early 18th century? These details are not incidental. They are part of how grief is structured, shared and made bearable. Because often the relationship between the living and the dead is mediated through memory, but also through something more tangible, through something you can hold, something you can taste, like an edible memento mori. And who better to explore this with than Dr. Dan O'Brien, with whom I'm currently writing a book on death and the Thames, The River Remembers, to be published by the History Press next year. Hello, Dan. How are you doing today?
Hello, Ali. I'm really, really well. I'm very glad to be here. I'm very, very delighted to talk all about death with you.
I knew you would. Now, Dr. Dan's research focuses on the undertaking trade and their products in 18th century England. And I wonder, Dan, would you be up for going through 10 objects or aspects to do with funerary food?
Yes. I think it would be a rather nice little journey into what I hope is not as much of a bleak subject as it sounds. I think it's a good cause for food.
I think so. The first thing I've got on my list is the biscuit wrapper. And the date is 1828 and we're in Yorkshire. Could you tell me a little bit about this?
So this is a really fascinating object. It's a perishable item which has somehow persisted through time. It no longer has its biscuit within it. But we have this wonderfully well-preserved piece of paper that is not too large in size. It would have wrapped around the biscuit at one time. And it has a wonderful printed message on it. And this, again, is so fascinating because perishable objects like this are so rarely seen. And they offer really, really deep and quite rich insight into people's everyday experience, the sorts of things that people do and see really without thinking about them. This is an object which usually would not have very much of an afterlife, a terribly perishable thing.
And it's kind of weird to think about it because obviously when we're thinking about death, food is sort of the last thing on our minds, and yet it's always there and it's always around us, and it kind of helps us carry on in a certain way and accept the fact that we are still living and we do still need food. And that takes us on to the Arville funeral biscuits. And biscuits, I mean, we've just talked about the wrapper. Now we're going to look at the biscuit. They seem to be something that are they seem to be quite common in the funerary context. Why is that?
Yes, funeral biscuits are one of these really interesting items of kind of, I suppose, memorial cuisine where people would quite often exchange biscuits at a funeral. Now, biscuits are items that are quite useful. They're very easy to make. They're very easy to shape. They can also be distributed quite easily to different groups of mourners, which makes them perfect because there's something about the biscuit in the funeral which is very tangible. You know, the ability to hand people these little objects that they then take away means that there's a little contract between the mourning party, perhaps even the deceased, and the mourners. And I think also, you know, when we look to examples of items being exchanged at the funeral, a biscuit can be exchanged in a lot of different settings and contexts. Now, when we think about these biscuits, the kind of things we're looking at are perhaps quite familiar in some respects. These are round items. They have a slightly spongy texture. They are sometimes examples are quite similar to the sort of ladies' fingers biscuits that you get in trifles, albeit in round form. So again, very unusual things to find at a funeral. These are things that are potentially quite sweet in taste, are quite almost treat-worthy. And yet we have them here in this context, a very sad context. You know, when we look at the wrapper that these biscuits came in, it notifies us that these were distributed at a funeral, you know, an occasion that we associate with sorrow, misery, sobriety, and somberness. So it's kind of an inversion of that in some respect.
And the sweetness really is a comfort, isn't it? I think that gives people an extra special feeling of maybe being grounded into something that's familiar at such a sad time. That leads us on to the black sealing wax, because this was a wax that was used to seal the biscuit wrappers. And so sealing it kind of transforms the food into something more formal, more controlled. It creates a little bit of a boundary, I think, between the ritual space of the funeral and that private moment of later consumption. So I think we can open up the discussion when it comes to authority and restraint and sort of when grief is permitted to enter the body. What do you think about this sealing wax?
Yes, I mean, black wax is fascinating. I've come across black wax on legal documents surrounding funerals as well. And it's quite an interesting thing. You find sometimes black wax on the funeral invitations that would come perhaps folded and then sealed with wax. And there is this sense, I suppose, that when one is presented with something that's sealed, there is that moment where we are presented with this closed item and we must break that seal and reveal its details to us. And I think that's really fascinating because, as we said, if we think about thresholds in funerals, there are those moments where, as individual mourners and also as a group of mourners, we approach that which has happened to us as a community or an individual, but then we also consider how we move on from that point. And there is something wonderfully poignant, I think, about the act of breaking that wax, breaking that seal, uncovering what's within, and really kind of taking that, I suppose, figurative step from the place that we find ourselves in before, whether that be as mourners or people who aren't yet aware that we are to mourn, and then moving from that to another state, a state of rebuilding ourselves, of sharing our experience of mourning with others. I think it's also really cool because, you know, when we think about these items, there's a wonderful fragility to them all round, you know, that really describes, I suppose, the self at this time. You know, when we have the idea, we have these very perishable biscuits. They are sealed away. They're presented to different mourners. And for each person, there's that opportunity to confront that sort of perishability, that we're presented with an item which we might consume, which we might take away as a souvenir. But in so doing, we're accepting our grief in the form of this biscuit. And we see that those around us have done the same thing. They've all accepted their biscuits as well.
There's a community spirit to this, and it's quite Gothic in the sense Gothic food wise, we are ingesting something which is in that moment other, this experience, this funerary experience, and we are placing it inside ourselves. And it is a moment of nearly inclusion of this very foreign state, which is not our state at the moment because we are alive. And yet there's an acceptance of that. So it really is very fascinating. And I have a question about our next aspect when it comes to the funerary context, which are the female servers. Firstly, about the gender, because it was always, I think, the women who walked in front of the coffin and they would distribute biscuits and wine. And that kind of maybe offers a moment for us to reflect on the gendered labour and the authority of care as well. So these women that were kind of feeding the living while escorting the dead. And I suppose it shapes a little bit the rhythm and tone of the mourning as well, but without speaking.
Yes, and there really is something quite interesting about the place of these servers in the funeral. In the example of Mrs. Oliver's funeral biscuit in the 1820s in Yorkshire, in rural Yorkshire, we have the sense that these servers precede the coffin and they hand out wine and biscuits to people. And also earlier in the 18th century, we have trade cards and funeral invitations which depict funerary hospitality. You know, people from the very clunkiest of woodcuts through to the finer detail of the late 18th century, who are depicted as servers at funerals, women offering little sweetmeats and little glasses of wine from trays. And there's a sense here that funerary hospitality is a very necessary and important thing, that it demonstrates not only our sense of affluence and plentifulness, that we're willing to share that with others, but also there's a sense that here we're kind of offering alms to others. We're offering something that's nourishing, that represents our bond to other people around us. And I think it's really interesting too that we have women distributing it, because women are such an important part of funerary management, particularly in rural areas, where they're responsible for preparing the dead, preparing the body before the funeral. They have a real investment in death in the community, which is appreciated and respected by people in the community.
Yes.
So it's an opportunity perhaps to see that which may have been taken for granted at the time, you know, this sense that these people are an integral part, not only of the individual's mourning, but also of a community's response to death within its numbers.
And of course, in any kind of gathering, you tend to find that there is some form of alcohol, Dan.
Yes.
What's going on? Now, there's wine for mourners, and that kind of accompanies the biscuits that are also given out as part of the funeral ritual. And so maybe there is some scope here for discussion on alcohol as a form of emotional regulation or certainly social bonding. What do you think about this?
Yeah, so the place of alcohol in the funeral is wonderful because it seems both necessary but also wonderfully problematic in some respects. There's a traveller who comes to England and views lots of English practices. His name is Henri Misson. Misson writes about the English funeral with quite a degree of aplomb. And in his writing, he describes the English relationship between funerals and alcohol. And he describes it thusly. He says, before they, the funeral party, set out and after they return, it is usual to present the guests with something to drink, either red or white wine, boiled with sugar and cinnamon or some such other liquor. Everyone drinks 2 or 3 cups, but the keeper of a tavern told me that there was a ton of red port drank at his wife's burial, besides mulled white wine. So this is from the early 1700s, and here we have people quite enthusiastically drinking what would essentially appear to be mulled wine at the funeral, and really, drinking 2 or 3 cups, drinking lots of alcohol in the company of other people, and that shared sense of drinking, of kind of sharing some degree of conviviality, brings people together, allows for an exchange of stories. It allows for some degree of, I suppose, emotional release. The stresses, the emotions that would come out when people start to have a few drinks, both before and after the funeral. This does create a problem, though. So when we think about the risks of drinking alcohol in plentiful quantities, particularly at an occasion where people are meant to be somber,
Yes.
maybe even sober in behavior. We do encounter examples of funerals where drink is the cause of a great degree of problems. So there's an example of a man called John Doyle. Doyle is kind of executed. I think he's a highwayman of sorts. He's killed and he's buried at St Sepulchre's in London. Now, at his funeral, a great deal of wine is given away. People are drinking. There's a ready amount of alcohol for people to enjoy. That means that a mob follows his funeral to his place of burial. A problem, of course, for the people who are managing the streets and a problem for the people who are using the streets. Likewise, there's an example of people in the countryside who ransack a funeral to steal the alcohol that's provided. There are lots of these really interesting examples where alcohol, in addition to perhaps being a spur for people's interpersonal relationships, is a cause of misdemeanor and danger, I suppose, for those who both attend and spectate the funeral.
Yes, there's a risk of perishing at an actual gathering where we are mourning someone who has perished.
I mean, there's a fantastic example. I can't remember quite when it was from the mid 1700s of a man who died after falling down some stairs, having returned home from a funeral. It's quite apparent this man had been drinking. And then has a very unfortunate fall and becomes the subject of a funeral himself. So it's
very meta. And what about the printed hymn verses? Now, maybe these verses were printed on the wrapper. Is that right? Normally there were hymns, so you would eat the biscuit, but then also at the same time you were reading the lines. So it's adds to this atmosphere of commemoration and sadness, really, and also thinking about bodily decay as we crumble the biscuits in our mouths. Or something like that.
Yes, and it's fascinating because in the example that we're focusing on, this very kind of moving hymn called Worthington by Charles Wesley, and we have the opening few passages from it, and it's a really interesting thing to consider. So if I briefly go through some of the words, it says, "Thee we adore the eternal name and humbly own to thee. How feeble is our mortal frame. What dying worms we be, our wasting lives grow shorter still as days and months increase, and every beating pulse we tell leaves but the number less." There's a sense here that there's a reminder of one's mortality, of one's perishability, but also as we find ourselves breaking and consuming this biscuit, an encounter with, that very natural process of consuming and eating. And if we think back to the memento mori, in the memento mori tradition, the human body becomes itself a meal for the worms. It becomes something that will nourish these most lowly of creatures, these conquering worms, so small in stature, but ultimately so triumphant in the flesh of the very mortal human being. So perhaps a rather macabre imagery to confront ourselves with, but one which allows for that moment of reflection. It's not a long kind of lingering contemplation of our end, but it's the sort of kind of pinprick reminder that brings us back and kind of reminds us that the death of another is a reflection upon our own death as well, that we don't see those around us who die as being any way different to ourselves. I think also in a Christian context, there's always this very focusing sense that, when we see round objects being kind of broken and eaten, that we reflect upon this idea of, Christ's body. And that's obviously a very Catholic idea. But there are people who argue, is this practice of taking and eating biscuits some kind of persistence of that Catholic tradition, the idea of transubstantiation?
I think it is. I hadn't thought of that. It's a kind of legacy of the host, isn't it, that you take and eat? Yes, I hadn't thought of that.
And it's a fascinating concept that, in these communities, you have this act which, although not expressly the consumption of the host, has these kind of curious reminders of that act of taking and breaking the host and reflecting upon the idea of, consuming that body and blood. And, when we think of people consuming biscuits and wine, we have an analogue there for the blood and the body of Christ. And this act which certainly within the Catholic faith, is quite an established part of the Mass. But
Yes.
here in maybe more remote Protestant England, it's a persistence of a tradition that has maybe lost its origins but continues on.
Yes. And I also think, a biscuit is quite small. You can just quickly unwrap it, pop it in your mouth, sort of thing. Have that, it's not a lasagna. It's
Mm,
not a shepherd's pie. It needs to be dry. It needs to be quick, I think,
mm,
portable.
mm,
It's nearly an action that's quite contained action. Yes, there's a communal aspect to it, but it's still for the individual. And as you said before, something I hadn't thought of, you receive the biscuit, you can decide to take it with you. You don't have to open and eat it there on site. Now, the name of the deceased is printed normally on the wrapper or included on a sort of card, and it anchors the name to the food, in a way to a specific life. And so food is also sort of a bearer of identity here. And we can talk maybe about how mourners become carriers of memory through consumption, through this example.
yes, and that idea of taking something away and carrying a memory is really, I think, is really quite interesting because there are different ways that we can see this. If we consider these biscuits as arval bread, this concept of arval, of succession, the idea of the passing on of things, the
Yes.
passing on of responsibilities within ancient communities that's persisted through, we can see that these people are going away with reminders of the deceased, a sort of prompt to memory, to remember the deceased in specific ways, in ways that might be favorable. I think also that there's this reflection of a sort of Catholic tradition of taking things and praying for the dead, of keeping the dead in mind, and the idea that food can be used as a vehicle for this. Now, certainly in medieval and sort of pre-Reformation, early modern period, you have large funeral meals for vast stretches of the community, which are intended to instill upon people the importance of remembering and praying for the person who's died, of keeping them in mind. I think there's no easier way to do that than perhaps to provide people with something that is of use to them. And food serves that role. Food can be given and consumed, and the act of taking it away or taking it at the time and consuming it is one that actively engages a person to remember and to hold a favorable memory, if anything. Because with some examples of funerary charity, we see the distribution of large quantities of bread to the poor. When you're distributing gifts to the poor or gifts of funeral biscuits to smaller groups of mournings, you're providing them with something. You're ensuring that that final memory between the two groups of people, the dead and the living, is one that's, as much as is possible, full of positivity. It provokes a good posthumous memory. It's a little encouragement to remember someone well and not unfavorably as well.
So we've covered the take home biscuit as well, the fact that they can be carried and taken away and obviously then perhaps never eaten, perhaps
Hmm.
just kept as a memory of that person as well.
And certainly you see with the example of like Swedish funerary confectionery, where it's quite popular at Swedish funerals to give away sweets of a kind.
Mm,
And I'm to understand that people wouldn't really eat these sweets, that they were
no.
usually quite hard, but you would take them away and you'd keep them. So when I was wandering around a museum in Sweden and saw all of these kind of funerary sweets, and it was fascinating because these were all examples of, again, that exchange of food as gifts, these little,
Yes.
very tough sweets given out as reminders of a person, taken away and kept as little mementos of people's memories.
So transitioning from the Arval feasts and biscuits, going to funeral tea and how that might reflect changing attitudes towards death. Tea is kind of domesticating mourning, making it more sociably manageable, perhaps. Maybe also creating a more familiar and comforting environment in which to discuss memory.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a fascinatingly long history of funerary dining. And one of the big trends that we see is the movement of funerary consumption in terms of food and drink from large very public gatherings through to very discreet, domesticated gatherings. So if we start sort of medieval, early modern period, it's quite common to have a large funerary feast. And quite frequently in the medieval, you may invite large groups of townspeople, of villagers, the poor, to this funerary feast, and they will be provided with large quantities of food, if you're a person of good standing. Over time, we see these traditions shift, and it's interesting how, as the centuries pass, we move away from large, communal, very generous gatherings to a rather more discreet consumption of funerary food, and also a very exacting distribution of funerary charitable food. So instead of large numbers of people being gathered to consume a big feast in a hall or in a large open public space, the food is taken to their houses, it's provided to them. And this is, for me, this is really fascinating because we still see attempts to distribute that charitable food, to give those gifts to people, but it's restrained, it's very specific, and people have to start reflecting upon who is worthy, who is not worthy.
Yes.
And I think also for the individual, for the funeral party themselves, it reflects that increase in privacy in funerals. You know, funerals as occasions shift from being a public response to a death to a very private response that's focused on different things. It's focused on notions of politeness, friendship, the very close bonds between family members. And as that progresses, we start to see the funeral meal and funeral dining occur within the closed setting of the funerary home. It involves a very specific number of recipients. And we see this in funeral tickets and invitations, which are themselves part of this practice of inviting a specific number of people to a specific place. Because often we'll have depictions of the mourning household on these cards, and there will be tiny scenes where we can see people gathered around a coffin in a room of mourning, maybe consuming some wine, maybe taking some sweetmeats or kind of sweet biscuits as well. And it's a very closed, very refined approach to funerary dining, quite different to the large open meals of the medieval.
Yes.
And it's interesting as we come into the Victorian, this meal, although very important, becomes a thing of reciprocity. You know, the idea is that we will go to someone else's funeral
Yes.
meal, they will come to ours. And I think one of the really fascinating items I've seen is a railway union funerary urn. Now, this isn't an urn as in an urn that you would be buried in. This is an urn for boiling water. And the idea is that you have this boiling water urn so that everyone can have their tea at the funeral. And that an important part of the funerary package provided and supported by the union is this tea urn that allows you to have that basic respectable standard. You know, the union's promises a good funeral for all of its members, and the urn is the means by which it's achieved. You know, so we have a sense of these things which are desirable, but also that which is necessary. And I think certainly one of the trends you see over the time is that funeral food and dining, drinking is always necessary. But the form of this and the groups of people who it gets distributed to are radically different from the medieval, early modern, 18th century and into the modern.
Yes, and these tools, the crockery, the wear around it, providing some dignity as well to the people that are there to say their goodbyes and who perhaps don't have the money. So that's very important as well. And it kind of leads on to this idea of celebrating the passing, paying homage in some way within close proximity to the body, but the body is no longer visible. So it's the absent body. And in a way, the food and the objects that surround it take on some meaning, which has a lot to do with the person who has passed, but also about the fabric of the society that they live in. And so really we are touching death without touching the body. We're consuming the memory without being able to touch the flesh. And we're just allowing grief to pass through our body as we're eating that food that commemorates the person.
I think it is interesting because when we view people's relationship with the body over these different periods of time, we see that gradual moving away from the body. It moves from something which is very obvious. In the medieval funeral, you have a shrouded body that's placed into the earth. It's a very naked encounter with death, with the realities of death. And then as we move into this time of domesticity and kind of privacy, the coffin becomes more prevalent. Now, in the first instances, that coffin is open. But over time, the coffin will be closed. The coffin becomes a more distant thing. So yeah, there's this need to encounter death in other forms, in forms which can be controlled and in forms which offer people both a personal and a collective engagement. We can encounter death as individuals, but we can also do that as a group as well.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting that food is something which has always been available to people to do that as well.
Yes.
Consuming food reminds us of those basic forces that we need to survive, but it also does so in a way that reminds us that we will continue. It reminds us of familiar pleasures and familiar things that we can both look back to, shared experiences, but also ways of looking forward. It allows us to have a sense of security in the future that's coming as well. A funeral that's well staged reflects well upon the participants' ability to persist beyond that moment.
Yes, and there's a sense of gratitude as well, I suppose,
Definitely,
that goes along with all of that. Well, Dan, I am, as you know, very curious. I have a curious appetite, and I wonder if you would like to tell us what your favourite food was growing up or as a child.
This is going to be quite an unusual answer. Probably my favourite food as a child would be sprouts. I used to love Brussels. I still do love Brussels sprouts. They're just so bizarre.
Is it that an association to Christmas?
I think you'd normally have them in that time of the year where it's quite cold, it's quite gloomy, and being a vegetarian, being in a position where I don't really eat meat, vegetables are quite a strong part. I always really loved that you had such a tiny thing that had so much flavour in it. And I think it was always unusual because it showed me I've always been a little bit different. I've always liked my vegetables, but yeah, it's always been there. And I think it's wonderfully overlooked. And then that's another thing I enjoy. I enjoy studying things that are by their nature overlooked and viewed as being rather unpleasant. So the fact that some people dislike sprouts has never really bothered me terribly much.
A sprout rebel. I love it. Well, that was a curious answer to my curiosity. I've never had someone answer sprouts before. And what's the weirdest food that you've ever had, funerary or not?
Gosh, the weirdest food that I've ever had. Goodness me. I said there was one thing I tried when I was in Sweden, and it was weird, but I liked it. It was salted licorice, but it was a sort of caramel flavored salted licorice. And it was a very chewable thing. I was struck by the fact that although they're very popular in Sweden, I'd never really encountered this flavor at all before. And I really wanted to try it. And it was so unusual. And I think what was nice about it was that it was something that I would never have had on any other occasion. But to try it and just to sample that sort of jumble of wonderful flavors that was completely unexpected, because it's not just salted licorice, it was salted licorice with lovely punch of caramel as well. And just, very nice.
That sounds delicious.
It was really very nice. And I never would have considered such a thing beforehand.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you, Dan. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Ali. It's been a great pleasure to talk both food and also funerals. Two things I can definitely enjoy.
Thank you for listening. This has been A Curious Appetite with Dr. Alessandra Pino. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you could rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps others find the show. If you have thoughts or questions or stories of your own, you can email me at acuriousappetite@gmail.com. And for more essays, behind-the-scenes notes, and a few extra dark morsels, you can subscribe to my Substack at A Curious Appetite, Dr. Alessandra Pino. Until next time, stay curious.